May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. There are times when, as preacher, you think you have a handle on what it is that you want to say, or at least have a beginning in mind. And then there are the times when you view a very familiar, even somewhat beloved passage and think, where do I go with this? Today's gospel is a familiar one, if not for the words of the text themselves, but the imagery of grapevines and branches that are a focal point of many stained glass windows, carvings, and ornamentation throughout all of Christendom. These are images, metaphors that would have been familiar to the disciples, gathered and listening to what was to become a series of final words of Jesus, as he prepares them, or at least tries to prepare them, for the upcoming events that will change the course of everything forever. Today's gospel was, in fact, for me, one of those where do I go at first? Because there are familiar images, to be sure, even comforting images. But then there's that whole bit about whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers, and such branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned, which carries with it the somewhat judgmental attitude that those not abiding in Jesus are deserving of being thrown out and burned, which can and sometimes does lead to a rabbit hole that asks, how do you know if your being pruned is going to result in your bearing more fruit, or then again, maybe not? What if pruning results in being a branch headed for the fire? Seriously, this could go either way. So on last Tuesday morning, I set the sermon aside and turned to review the epilogue of Cast for our final meeting of the book study. And there I found the way I needed to go. There was the message I was hearing for this sermon. And so I need to give a shout out, a thanks, and a dedication to the group of folks who gathered together for the past 5 Tuesdays and made their way through the challenging, yet in the end rewarding work of Isabel Wilkerson. But first, let's get back to the passage. In her commentary on this passage, Meta Stamper suggests that the vine image is another way of talking about abiding places, places where one is deeply at home. And both the vine and the abiding places are ways of talking about love. The branches have to abide because without the vine, they are fruitless. They can do nothing. But they also have to be pruned, cut back, prepared for a new beginning, because that is the only way they can continue to bear new fruit. Stamper goes on to point out that there is no real future in focusing on those fruitless branches. In the first place, we're all just branches ourselves, not vines, and certainly not in charge of the vine. That's God. We don't even make ourselves fruitful. She goes on to point out that we cannot possibly discern what's happening with the rest of the vine. For all we know, what looks like removal could actually be pruning for more fruitfulness. But whatever is going on with the other branches is, in any case, the work of the vine grower, the work of God. And in John's Gospel, Stamper points out, our sole responsibility to the rest of the branches is to love. And Isabel Wilkerson would add, or at least have radical empathy. Reflecting back on the last 5 weeks, reading Cass could be thought of as a long and often true struggle to prune back the layers of preconceived ideas, of thoughts and perceptions of how our society has worked for over 400 years. Thoughtfully written with metaphor, example, and witness, Wilkerson helps her reader to see through a different lens, to understand in a new way, to lay down or, yes, prune back that which we need to rid ourselves in order to produce new fruit. Radical empathy, she writes, means putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart, to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we imagine we would feel. She goes on to write, radical empathy is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation that you have never been in and perhaps never will be. It is the kindred connection that comes from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. The irony, or perhaps a better way to say it, the hand of the Spirit, in the timing of this book study was not lost on me. That we were reading Wilkinson's words at the same time, it seemed the whole world was focused on the trial, and that the verdict came down on a late Tuesday afternoon, just before we Zoom gathered. There was, with the verdict, a sense of release, a letting go of emotions that had been on edge and in waiting, poised to swing either way, a sense of completion, a sense of victory. Still, it was a moment that was not allowed to be isolated from the world beyond Minneapolis. Since the beginning of the trial, we had seen in Virginia a Black lieutenant on active duty in the Army pulled over, pepper sprayed at point blank range, pulled from his car, handcuffed, and forced to his knees for simply driving while being Black. We had witnessed the killing of Dante Wright, a young Black father in Brooklyn Center, after a traffic stop because his license tabs had expired. And on the day of the verdict, we witnessed the shooting death in Ohio of Micaiah, a young Black girl, albeit with a knife, at the hands of the police, and the shooting death in North Carolina of Andrew, an unarmed Black man, again by police, who were there to serve a search warrant. In other words, while the verdict was indeed an open door, revealing a pathway toward light, it was just that, a pathway, a start, a beginning of the journey. Not the completion. Or in the metaphor of today's gospel, there is still much pruning yet to be done. Pruning is not delicate work. The cleanup crew yesterday can attest to that. One does not prune with a paintbrush or a feather duster. Pruning is not a suggestion or even a request. One prunes with a tool called pruning shears, a sharp tool with a strong mechanism to snap the dead parts away with a cut and a swift motion. It can be unsettling. It can be disturbing. It can be painful. It is always necessary. For then it is always followed by new growth. It is always necessary to prune to achieve abundant fruit. And here's the thing to remember about the fruit being produced. The branch does not produce the fruit for its own benefit. In fact, the branch has little, if any, control over who or what will be the beneficiary of the fruit. The fruit that results in our pruning, which results in our laying aside that which is no longer of benefit, that which is preventing us from fully living into our baptismal covenant, is a fruit that we freely share without condition for the life of the world. Sharing fruit can be risky business, but it is important to remember that we are not in charge of the fruit. We're not in charge of the pruning that results in the fruit. We are the branches abiding in a place of deep love in the vine, not the vine, and certainly not the vine grower. Isabel Wilkerson closes her epilogue with the following. In a world without caste, we would see that when others suffer, the collective human body is set back from the progression of our species. A world without caste would set us all free. This morning, I would like to leave you with the words that a word without caste is the kingdom of God here on earth. Amen.